You hear wood creak. Hundreds of bodies shifting at once on packed benches, silk against wool. Breath held so tight the room hums with it. The air smells of damp stone and candle smoke and sweat. Run your hand along the bench beneath you. The oak is slick, polished by decades of lawyers' sleeves, warm where 100 nervous palms have gripped it before yours. Now look down. There's a woman on the floor. She's on her knees. Not in prayer, not in defeat. She's kneeling in front of the most powerful man in England, and every person in this room knows what she's about to do will change everything. Look at her hands. They're clasped, steady, no tremor. Now look at his face. Henry VIII, King of England, 38 years old, 6 feet tall, wearing gold. He leans forward. He tries to raise her. She does not move. He tries again. She stays. It's June 21st, 1529, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The Parliament Hall of the Dominican Friary of Blackfriars, London. And what happens next will take exactly 4 minutes. 4 minutes that will cost England its religion, its monasteries, its dead, and its relationship with God as it knew him for 1,000 years. This is not a movie. This is a court transcript. This was a Tuesday in Tudor England. Kings divorced queens. It happened. Louis XII of France had gotten an annulment in 1498 by claiming his wife was too ugly. This should have been paperwork. The version of this story you've been told is a lie. They show you the victim, the sad wife who steps aside while Anne Boleyn sweeps in. What they don't show you is the woman who walked out of a king's own courtroom. They don't show you that Henry needed 6 years, 2 archbishops, 1 new religion, and the destruction of every monastery in England, all to divorce a woman who refused to sign. Welcome to Unleashed Secrets, where we dig into the blood-soaked truths history tried to bury. You've heard of Catherine of Aragon, the first wife, the one before Anne Boleyn. You think you know this story. You don't. What I'm about to show you comes from court transcripts, ambassadorial dispatches, and letters that survive to this day. By the end of this, you'll know 3 things most people never learn. First, that Catherine of Aragon won the only major military victory of Henry's early reign, sent him a dead king's bloody coat as a trophy, and was pregnant while doing it. Second, that the entire English Reformation, the break from Rome, the destruction of 900 monasteries, the executions of Thomas More and John Fisher, can be traced back to one biological question about one night in 1501 that nobody can answer to this day. Third, that when they opened Catherine's body after she died, every organ was healthy except one. Her heart was completely black. We're building a community of 10,000 truth seekers, and we need you to get there. Click subscribe. This is the story of how one woman's refusal to accept a lie dismantled 1,000 years of English Christianity, and how the man who built a new religion to escape her died before she was proven right. To understand what Catherine refused to surrender, you need to understand what she was. She was the daughter of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, the 2 monarchs who unified Spain, completed the Reconquista, and financed Columbus. Peter Martyr d'Anghiera, the Italian humanist at the Spanish court, documented her education: Latin, canon law, history, theology. She spoke fluent classical Latin before she was 12. She arrived in England in 1501, at 15, to marry Arthur Tudor, Prince of Wales. The wedding at St. Paul's Cathedral on November 14th was the most expensive spectacle Henry VII had ever staged. She was escorted by Arthur's 10-year-old brother. That brother's name was Henry. Arthur died 5 months later. Catherine was 16, a widow in a foreign country. For 7 years, she was kept in diplomatic limbo between her father, Ferdinand, and Henry VII. The Spanish ambassador Rodrigo de Puebla reported she sometimes lacked adequate funds for food. In 1509, Henry VII died. The 18-year-old Henry VIII took the throne and married Catherine. He was 17, she was 23. Here's what Catherine did with that crown. In 1513, Henry left for France to play soldier. He appointed Catherine as regent, governor of the realm, and captain general of the forces. Not a ceremonial title. Real power. While Henry was in France winning nothing more than a skirmish the French called the Battle of the Spurs, Scotland invaded from the north. Catherine mobilized. She sent money, artillery, and supplies north. She ordered Thomas Lovell to raise a second army. She rode north in full armor, while heavily pregnant, to address the troops. On September 9, 1513, at Flodden Field, the English army destroyed the Scots. King James IV was killed, along with 12 earls, 2 bishops, and most of the Scottish aristocracy. Catherine sent Henry a piece of the dead king's bloodied coat. She wrote, "Your grace shall see how I can keep my promise, sending you for your banners a king's coat." Think about what this means. The woman Henry would later call obstinate had won him the most decisive military victory of his reign. She'd done it pregnant, in armor, from the back of a horse. Read that again. So how do you go from sending your husband a dead king's coat to being locked in a castle and erased from history? The answer is biology. Between 1510 and 1518, Catherine experienced at least 6 pregnancies. Sir John Dewhurst, the medical historian who analyzed the surviving documents most rigorously, concluded 4 ended in stillbirths. 1 produced a son who lived exactly 52 days, and only 1 child survived. Mary, born February 18, 1516. The Venetian ambassador confirmed each loss in dispatches to Venice. The 1514 stillbirth, he wrote, was to the very great grief of the whole court. By 1525, Catherine was 40. No more pregnancies. 1 daughter. No son. Here's what Henry believed. In the book of Leviticus, chapter 20, verse 21, it states, "If a man takes his brother's wife, they shall be childless." Henry had married his brother's widow. His children kept dying. In Henry's mind, this wasn't bad luck. This was God's punishment, and the only cure was annulment. This wasn't madness. This was theology, filtered through desperation and desire. Henry needed a male heir. His father had taken the crown by force at Bosworth Field. Without a son, civil war loomed. And conveniently, there was a young woman at court named Anne Boleyn who had made it clear she would not be a mistress. She would be a queen, or nothing. It was like filing for divorce and discovering your wife's nephew owns the courthouse, the judge, and the appeals court, because that's exactly what happened next. Under canon law, the path should have been straightforward. Henry needed the Pope to declare that the original dispensation, issued by Julius II in 1503, was invalid. Other monarchs had obtained annulments for far less. But here's what Henry didn't anticipate. Catherine's nephew was Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. In 1527, Charles's troops sacked Rome and effectively held Pope Clement VII prisoner. The Pope could not annul Catherine's marriage without offending the emperor. So he stalled. He appointed Cardinal Campeggio to hear the case in England, but secretly ordered him to drag things out as long as possible. The same civilization that gave Europe the Renaissance papacy also gave it a pope too terrified to say yes or no. And that paralysis handed Catherine the one thing she needed: time. Catherine knew exactly what was happening. She fought back. She wrote directly to Pope Clement. She wrote to Charles V. She mobilized the most powerful diplomatic network in Europe against her own husband. Giles Tremlett in Catherine of Aragon, Henry's Spanish queen, documents how she outmaneuvered Henry's legal team at every turn, appealing over their heads to Rome. But her greatest weapon was simpler than diplomacy. It was a single word: no. Henry sent delegations to her. Accept the annulment, take the title of Princess Dowager, retire to a convent, live quietly. She refused. Every time, every delegation, every offer. She signed every document with 3 words: Catherine the Queen. Scholars sometimes call this the Great Refusal, a term modern historians use to describe Catherine's systematic, legally grounded resistance to every mechanism Henry deployed. It wasn't emotion. It wasn't stubbornness. It was a calculated legal and theological position maintained for 9 years, without a single concession. And its defining moment came at Blackfriars. Imagine it from her side. You'd buried 5 children. You'd held a son, alive, breathing, named after his father, for 52 days before burying him too. You'd watched your husband's eyes drift. You'd been told God himself was punishing you. You'd been told your marriage, 20 years, 6 pregnancies, a war, was a sin. And now you'd been summoned to a courtroom to watch 2 foreign cardinals decide whether you had ever been a wife at all. The crowd cheers as you walk in. You know this is the last time anyone in power will listen. On June 21st, 1529, at the Legatine Court at Blackfriars, Henry speaks first. He praises Catherine publicly, calls her a good wife, then explains, with great theatrical sorrow, that his conscience is troubled. Then Catherine stands. She crosses the room. She kneels before Henry, in front of the entire court. The 2 cardinals, the bishops, the lawyers, the packed gallery. Henry tries to lift her. Twice. She does not move, and then she speaks. She reminds him that she has been his true and faithful wife for 20 years, that she has given him divers children. And then she says the line that destroys him: "When ye had me at the first, I take God to be my judge, I was a true maid, without touch of man." We'll never know for certain whether Catherine and Arthur consummated their marriage on that November night in 1501. English witnesses testified that Arthur emerged the next morning, boasting he had been in the midst of Spain. But Juan de Gamarra, a boy in Catherine's service, testified in Zaragoza in 1531 that her lady-in-waiting Francisca de Cáceres reported nothing happened, and the ladies had laughed at the prince. Historians still fight about this: a 15-year-old's boast or a queen's lifelong lie. We don't know. But Catherine swears it under oath, in public, to God, before the court, before her husband, and before history. And she never, ever recants. Then she stands, she curtsies to the king, and she walks out of the courtroom. The usher calls for her to return. She says, and George Cavendish, Cardinal Wolsey's gentleman usher, who is personally present, records this. On. It makes no matter, for it is no impartial court for me. I will not tarry. She never comes back. Not to that court, not to any court, not ever. Here's what one woman's no cost. Henry couldn't get his annulment through Rome, so he built an entirely new system to get it without Rome. In 1532, Thomas Cromwell began pushing legislation through Parliament to strip the Pope of authority. In January 1533, Henry secretly married Anne Boleyn. On May 23, 1533, Thomas Cranmer, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, declared Catherine's marriage void at Dunstable Priory. Catherine refused to attend. she signed her response, Catherine the Queen. On November 28, 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, declaring Henry the supreme head of the Church of England, 1,000 years of connection with Rome, severed. The Treasons Act followed. Deny the king's supremacy, and you die. Thomas More refused to take the oath. Beheaded July 6, 1535. Cardinal John Fisher refused. Beheaded June 22, 1535. Both died because they believed what Catherine believed. The marriage was valid, the Pope was right, the king was wrong. Then came the dissolution. Between 1536 and 1539, Henry destroyed nearly 900 religious houses. 900, one torn down every 48 hours for 4 straight years. George W. Bernard has called it the greatest dislocation of people, property, and daily life since the Norman Conquest. 12,000 monks, nuns, and friars displaced. Over a quarter of all cultivated land in England confiscated. This was policy. This was infrastructure. This was the cost of the Great Refusal. Catherine spent her final years at Kimbolton Castle in Cambridgeshire, a 14th-century rectangular courtyard house surrounded by a moat. The architecture tells the story the documents understate. Doors that locked from the outside, windows overlooking nothing but fenland. And in July 1534, when a diplomat's jester tried to swim the moat to reach her, he was turned back. When her closest friend, Maria de Salinas, came in the January 1536, she lied to the guards, claiming lost paperwork, just to get through the door. Henry forbade Catherine from seeing their daughter Mary. He stripped her title. Catherine refused. She signed every letter with 3 words, Catherine the Queen. After the Act of Supremacy, using that title was technically treason. She used it until her last breath. On January 7, 1536, Catherine died at Kimbolton. She was 50. 8 hours later, on Henry's express orders, her body was opened. The chandler, a candlemaker, not a physician, reported every organ healthy except one. Her heart was quite black and hideous to look at, with a dark growth attached. Chapuis describes the procedure to Charles V with the detachment of a clerk filing an inventory, organs catalogued, condition noted, heart set aside, like he's reporting damaged goods in a warehouse. That casualness is itself the evidence. This was how queens ended in Tudor England. Modern pathologists suggest a melanotic sarcoma. But in 1536, nobody knew what cancer was. They knew what a black heart meant. Edward Hall recorded that Henry dressed in yellow at the news. Anne Boleyn wore yellow too. Whether this was celebration or the Spanish color of mourning, historians disagree. Chapuis reported that later. Both wept privately. We'll never know for certain. But here's what happened next. On the day of Catherine's funeral, January 29, 1536, Anne Boleyn miscarried. The child was a boy. 4 months later, Anne was arrested. On May 19, 1536, she was beheaded. Henry had been married to Anne for 3 years. Catherine had lasted 24. The same civilization that produced the Magna Carta also produced a legal system where a king could rewrite the laws of God because one woman wouldn't say yes. Catherine's daughter Mary took the throne in 1553. She reversed the Reformation. She restored papal authority. She burned 287 Protestants at the stake, earning the name Bloody Mary. The religion Henry built to escape Catherine? His own daughter tore it apart to honor her mother. 20 years after the Great Refusal, its consequences were still detonating. Catherine was buried at Peterborough Cathedral, not as a queen, but as a dowager princess. Today, a simple stone marks the grave. Every year, flowers still appear on it. Henry VIII wanted a quiet annulment. He expected Catherine to retire to a convent and disappear. Instead, her refusal forced him to break with Rome, create a new church, execute his advisors, and dissolve 900 monasteries. He married 5 more women. He got his son, Edward VI, who died at 15. The throne passed to Catherine's daughter, then to Anne Boleyn's. The Tudor line ended with both of them. He built a new religion to escape her. She never signed. He died first. And somewhere in the records, in the cramped handwriting of a woman forbidden to call herself what she was, every letter, every petition, every defiance ends the same way. 3 words: Catherine the Queen. And if you listen carefully, in the vaulted silence of a courtroom at Blackfriars, on a June afternoon in 1529, you can still hear wood creak, hundreds of bodies shifting, breath held tight, and a woman on her knees who refuses to stand until she is ready.